as much for us as a human rights organization as you were saying it does for business.
Ian.
I think it's also partly about dialogue, in that, particularly in the political world, and I suspect in all the other worlds too, it's a case of not just being in broadcast mode, it's being in receive as well. And I think it's a great change for particularly politicians to think like that. Before 10, 20, 30 years ago, they've been used to pontificating, talking to people or talking at people rather than to them. Whereas now, particularly in the internet age, you've got this two-way dialogue going, and I think politicians and the media are struggling to cope with this, particularly the media actually. You see the way that newspapers are now all sort of frantically trying to start up or encourage their journalists to start their own blogs, whereas very few of the journalists actually want to do it, but they think, well, it's the thing we've got to do now, to have a dialogue with our readers. For politicians, it's the same. You've got the Cameron Tosser campaign on debt was a good example, where they'd never really done this kind of thing before, but sort of having this website that tried to engage young people drew a lot of cynicism from sort of 40, 50-year-old hacks, but actually it did the trick. The web Cameron thing has done the trick, because they've got 500,000 people tuning into it and actually leaving comments and interacting with it. And I think a lot of people are struggling to come to terms with the fact that they now have to engage with people in a way that they didn't before.
Can I just make one other point? I think the important thing is resonance with your own values. I think trust is all about that. So if you stand for something, you say you stand for something, and you actually are perceived, or you actually end up doing something else, that's when trust falls. Yeah. I mean, you were talking about stereotypes earlier. You know, there is the negative stereotype, but then there are also the positive images, self-images that we create as companies or as NGOs or as religious institutions, but when we don't live up to them. If I talk about religious institutions, when the Catholic Church fails to address child sexual abuse, it loses trust. When Enron fails to actually, you know, deliver what it says it purports to deliver, it loses trust. So again, I think this whole business about values, and therefore it's not enough just to resonate with the agenda of the public, but actually to be able to do what you are expected by the public to do.
My name is Dominic Kemps from Pfizer. It's on, yeah. I'd like to reiterate the point, and also something that the Reverend said, and that is, I look around the room and I nodded a lot at this presentation, and it was, you know, it was like preaching to the converted. Like a lot of that resonated with me. It seemed familiar because obviously you canvassed people like ourselves. But when I think of like my customer group, or for example last year I was here with a different hat on as an NGO, when I think of my customer group then, it's not necessarily reflective of those people and those customers. And to echo the Reverend's point, I think that given the comment that was just made as well, reaching out to a broader audience, if that is possible in future years, I think will give us a more kind of diverse set and richer set of data that for you and for our purposes actually kind of reflects more of society.
Okay, I'll take it. Wait, from our point of view, what we're trying to reach are the influencers. I mean, we think about the donut model of communication, so we're trying to reach out to those influencers. But I think in terms of reaching out to broader communities, you say it's not reflective. I don't know how Amnesty's data would compare from a consumer point of view to an elite's point of view.
Well, I would say that in the BRIC countries, for example, you would get a very different response if you go to the top quartile or to the bottom quartile. And as in terms of influence also, I think in some countries it's wrong to see income as producing influence. So you may want to look at who you're actually speaking to in your survey more carefully.
I think the reason I said that, and I want to reinforce that, thanks Irene, what you've just said holds so true. The fact is there, in the UK in particular, we're finding that you don't find those from my particular ethnic background necessarily in your donut model, you know, because you find that the senior management is seemingly reserved for the white upper middle class, upper class, you know, and it's you know, I'm not trying to deal with issues around, I mean, I sit on the London board for the Commission for Racial Equality, so you've got to forgive me if I hit on some key points. You know, the fact is there is institutional racism even in business, and so our views and our perceptions are not necessarily understood by the upper class that's you might call your influencers. So our world is totally ignored because we don't have representation to express views here. And so perceptions are different based upon where you're sitting. And so I just think that, and yet we hold very strong influence, even though we might not necessarily have, in fact, we do have the money, but some people just don't know we have the money.
I mean, I think the slide on the global issues the UK wants to address is illustrating exactly what you say there, because it's got 77% global warming, 59% poverty alleviation, 52% human rights, and then down at the bottom is immigration, 18%. Now, if you ask people, you've asked influencers, whatever they are, I'm not surprised that that says that. If you did a YouGov poll and asked the general population, I suspect that that 18% might be rather higher and some of these others might be rather lower.
I would take that with a pinch of salt, because there's another public opinion poll that I was looking at recently, done by the UN on issues, and the issues actually came out pretty close to what you have identified, where immigration, terrorism, etc. was far lower in people's agenda, and unemployment was high. It doesn't appear on yours much, but those kinds of issues up there. So I think that at a very broad level, you're probably getting the right answers, but there are specificities that you're missing, and that's what you might want to refine.
I have time for one more question.
Thanks. I'm actually going to steal something from The Economist that I read on Sunday. Much to the shock of my husband. I don't think he's ever seen me read it before. I was absolutely fascinated by the importance of good employee relations. And I wondered how far the panel thought that might, in fact, be, I think it was fair treatment of employees was the definition you used. I wondered how far the panel thought that might actually be a reaction to people's fears about globalisation, in fact, and the protectionism agenda that we're seeing increasingly in America. And I wondered whether or not that was something that you'd observed.
Certainly. Robert, please do.
Yes, well, having read all the bits in The Economist on the globalisation over the weekend, I think it's all of those things. I don't think it's one of them, because employment hits at the absolute belly of insecurity. Very interesting. Young Arabs all across North Africa and the Middle East, when asked what is their key issue, and everyone would rather assume that you're going to say, well, it's going to be Israel and Palestine, isn't it? But actually 98% usually, the figures I've seen, are concerned about your future relation to unemployment. I mean, I do agree with Irene. I'm very surprised actually it's not there so much. It's a very high issue. So what you've got is you've got everything kicking in. You've got insecurity about outsourcing, insourcing. You've got it's Walmart's Achilles heel, incidentally, as well as in some cases a saving point. It's also the area where you can get common cause. It's also the area in which everyone can relate to. It's much more difficult to relate to global warming. You could say it's bad weather, therefore it's affecting me. But everyone can understand the employment issue. And also it's the, you spend more time normally at work than with your loved ones or anything else. So I think it's absolutely at the centre, and I think it's all the issues. It's all the insecurities, it's all the opportunities, it's all the worries about decency, it's all the things you can relate to. So I'm not surprised that it's come. The other point that I think Irene and I agree on, we talked about earlier, is that what's actually happening in this whole kind of sustainability mix now, very, very subtly, and none of us who are involved in this would ever have believed this, I think, a few years ago, that they're all morphing into a single issue, which Richard here would call the kind of green issue, and that is that social rights, economic rights, corruption, and environment are becoming much more solidified as a single multifaceted issue, which, as far as poor people in the world are concerned, of course that's true, because there's almost no difference between all those if you're sitting in the middle of Africa or in an Indian village or whatever. So I think we've got to be very, very careful when we parcel these things off. But I think